Hey crew, before we get started today and get into a fun and fascinating discussion about Tribbles with Paula and Terry, I wanted to remind you that Paula and Terry's many books about Star Trek and other movies and TV shows are available on Amazon. From the Deep Space Nine Companion to Star Trek 101 to Star Trek The Magic of Tribbles, which is basically a print version of what we're talking about today. They're all available for purchase on Amazon. So if you're looking for further reading, click through the link in the notes for this show to get to Amazon. And when you're there, a small percentage of every purchase you make will go to support this show at no extra cost to you. Paula and Terry have an eye for detail, or more than one eye, several eyes, and they've had unfettered access to the world of Star Trek for years, so their books are informative and comprehensive, and they're a must-have for diehard fans. I also wanted to announce that Enterprising Individuals is going on the road. We will be in Riverside, Iowa next week, June 29th and 30th, for TrekFest 34. Riverside is, of course, the future birthplace of James Tiberius Kirk, and for over 30 years, the people of Riverside have been throwing a bash to celebrate Starfleet's most decorated captain and shortest-serving admiral. The theme of this year's fest is Khan! And the featured guest speakers are John and Maria Jose Tenuto, who are former guests of this show, and they are the foremost Khan experts that I know. We'll be reporting from the fest, so this might be a good time to subscribe to our Facebook and Twitter feeds if you haven't already. They're at EISTPOD on both Facebook and Twitter, and you can find us on Instagram while you're at it, also at EISTPod, because we will be definitely taking pictures from the fest. All right, that's enough business. Enjoy my talk with Paula and Terry about trials and tribble-ations. Let's get underway.
It's worked so far, but we're not out yet.
I want to know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I want to know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy.
Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, a.k.a. Caliban, and here's a suggestion. If Paramount is looking to pay tribute to another classic Trek episode, the 50th anniversary of Spock's brain is this year. It'd be a no-brainer. I'm joined on this episode by Paula Block and Terry Erdmann. Paula is a former senior director of licensing for CBS Consumer Products and formerly the co-editor and judge of Pocketbooks' Strange New Worlds competition. Terry is a former motion picture publicist who created marketing campaigns for such films as Star Trek V, Willow, and Aliens. Together, they are the authors of many reference books about the films and series set in the Star Trek universe. They're also fiction authors as well, having written several Pocket DS9 ebooks, the most recent of which is I, the Constable, a noir-themed DS9 novel featuring Odo. Paula and Terry, welcome to the show.
Hi, Aaron.
Glad to be here.
Hi, people.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody. Glad to have you. Permission to come aboard granted. Today we'll be talking about Trials and Tribble-ations, the 6th episode of the 5th season of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Of all the props, aliens, and creatures in the Star Trek universe, there are perhaps none so memorable as the humble Tribble. Beginning with their introduction in David Gerrold's original series episode, Tribbles have gone on to appear in other Trek films, Trek movies, and have become emblematic of the love Trekkies have for their favorite show. When the 30th anniversary of the episode rolled around, Paramount decided to pay tribute to the Tribble phenomenon and the endurance of the original series by producing an episode of Deep Space Nine that would see DS9's crew thrust back in time and into the events of the Trouble with Tribbles. But this wouldn't be a few scenes of new footage inserted among the old. A talented team of writers, engineers, and effects artists pooled their efforts to produce an episode that not only homages the original series, but was a showcase for what technical effects had become capable of since Trek's early days. But we'll talk about that a little later in the show. First, Paula and Terry, every time I have guests on, I always ask how they first discovered Star Trek, how they first became a fan.
Okay. I'm really old. That's what I always start out with.
All right.
Which means I saw Star Trek in its first run while I was in high school. And I liked it immediately. I think the first episode I actually remember, I may have seen The Man Trap before it, but the first episode I actually remember was Charlie X, and I just thought that was fabulous. I loved the ending of it. It was so sad, you know.
Yeah.
And it just made me want to watch more, because I thought, gee, this is science fiction with an emotional basis.
Right.
so I watched it until it ended, and then I went away to college, and kind of nothing happened for a minute, but like I think within my second year or third year of college, suddenly it went into syndication.
Right.
And that was brilliant because it was on every day, you know. So I would get to go into one of the rooms with a television set in my dorm and watch it, you know, along with the one or two other geeks. And, you know, and I watched it a lot and got to know it well and found out at my school there was a Star Trek club, and those people seemed to know even more than I did about Star Trek because they had discovered Lincoln Enterprises and were collecting slides, and they could identify an episode by just looking at the cant of Spock's eyebrow, you know. So, and, you know, I was really impressed, and I started doing fanzines with them and going to conventions and working at conventions and all of that until it was in the 1980s, and I decided, okay, enough of that. So, and then eventually I got sucked back into it by, I fell in love with Terry and moved to Hollywood, moving from my New York job, and found it. And a year later, there was an opening at Paramount Pictures for somebody, and the qualifications were someone who has a publishing background, which I did, and who knows a lot about Star Trek. And I thought, geez, this is the only job I've ever had that I was qualified for, you know. And the rest is kind of history.
Did they ask you about Spock's eyebrows to get the job? That would seems
No,
like...
because the reason they needed somebody who knew a lot about Star Trek was because they knew very little about Spock's
Okay, I see. Terry, what about you?
Well, meeting Paula was fortuitous for me. We'll be there in a second. I'm even older than Paula, and I happened to be playing guitar in a rock and roll band with a full-time gig in a nightclub in Fargo, North Dakota.
Okay. And
every night, the drummer in the band would sit at the bar and stare at this TV set that was up behind the bar, and then we started, I don't remember, it must have been 7:30. When was Star Trek first on? 7:30. And we had to start playing, so we'd get on stage, and like once a week, the drummer would say, "Stand over there, I'm trying to see the TV," and he'd look across the dance floor, across the pool table, across the bar at this little tiny, 12-inch TV set up back there. And one day I said, "What are you watching?" And he said, "It's a science fiction show, and it's got these alien creatures, and it's really good, and I always get to see the first half but not the last half." So he started explaining it to me, and but it took a few years before I really understood what it was. I knew the word Spock, and I knew Beam Me Up, Scotty. Right. And then when it went into syndication, I said, "Oh, I remember when that was on behind the bar," and I started watching, and I really, really liked it. But and so then I went to the motion picture and the first 4 movies, and by that time I was working as a publicist for 20th Century Fox Pictures, and one of the executives there left and went over and became an executive of Paramount Pictures, and she called me and she said, "We're going to have a Star Trek movie coming up. Will you be the publicist on the film?" And I got hired to be the on-set publicist, the unit publicist on Star Trek V. And just out of nowhere, with that little bit of knowledge about Star Trek, suddenly I found myself on a private airplane flying up to Yosemite with Bill Shatner and Leonard Nimoy.
Right.
And I needed to know more about Star Trek than I actually did, just from, I had seen The Voyage Home twice in the big screen and such. Sure. But right there was Paula Block. And so if I had a question, she knew all the details. And I don't know, we just became a team.
Sure.
His in-house researcher.
Yeah, right.
I had an instant encyclopedia right at hand. It was wonderful.
Yes, even before my Kakutas.
Right, yeah. Paula, I have a lot of friends and guests on the show who got their start in writing Trek Lit by being published in Strange New Worlds. Yeah. In your former role as a director of licensing, were you working essentially as like a type of editor for Tie-In Works?
Yes. And it wasn't just Star Trek, but that was the bulk of the publishing coming out the licensing department. We were basically responsible for tie-in products for any motion picture or TV show that someone wanted to make a product based on.
Okay.
So I was in charge of publishing, so I got to do all magazines and books and comic books and whatever. Eventually, role-playing games and things like that when those got invented. Okay. And I even got a staff eventually because there was too much stuff for just me to do. But so I was in charge of basically not editing the books so much as reviewing them for content.
Okay.
And it would make me a little bit nuts if I couldn't correct grammar flaws and things, but that was up to the editors at the publishing house. So if it was really, really bad, I would just send them a little P.S., could you have the copy editor take another look at this?
Okay, sure. When you two collaborate, do you gravitate to an editorial role?
No, not really. Well, we edit each other very severely. Our writing style is kind of unusual.
Okay.
Yeah,
Tell me about it.
We were both English majors. So we both understand sentence structure, the use of the verb, the et cetera, all of those things, punctuation. We're both really, really good at it. But what we will do, like on all of the behind-the-scenes books that we've both written on, and actually even though my name is only on the original ones, Paula was always there. Mm-hmm. And then on our recent fiction, we'll choose chapters, and one of us will write a chapter and give it to the other one, who will do a lot of work on it and hand it back, and the first run will say, but that's not what I meant, and change it back again. And after we pass it back and forth 3 or 4 times, suddenly we look at it and we'll say, by golly, it's done.
Yeah, so we both really take an editing role on it.
How did you get your start in working on reference books for films and TV shows?
Well,
this is a big story.
Yeah, well, let me start it just to say I was the contact to the editors. I knew all of them. Uh-huh. And one of them one day said,
At Simon & Schuster.
At Simon & Schuster, Pocket Books Division. At the time, they had the exclusive rights to all book publishing for Star Trek. So one of the editors called me up and said, we're going to do a Deep Space Nine companion based on that new show that's starting up. And we talked about it, and I said, well, I can't work on it because I work for the company, and that would be considered a conflict of interest.
Right.
And he says, well, your husband's a publicist. He writes a lot of press kits and stuff, doesn't he? And I said, yeah, he wrote the one for Star Trek V. So I sent that off to him, and he really liked it. And he called up Terry. And so Terry got into the biz.
Yeah, I had been writing ad copy and press material on motion pictures for, 10 years by this time. I worked on a lot of motion pictures. Mm-hmm. And everybody liked my writing, but I'd never written anything longer than maybe, 20 pages, a couple thousand words.
A press kit.
Production notes, a press kit. And but Kevin, he was the editor at the time at Pocket. He said, let's do this. So they introduced me to the marketing department at Paramount Television, and they walked me over and introduced me on the set, and I started just hanging out watching Deep Space Nine being shot. And these were such wonderful people. Within 4 or 5 visits to the set, within a week or so, I found myself hanging out, with the whole cast and crew. Wow. And it was such a thrill to be there. So I spent the next, 6.5 years literally living on the set of Deep Space Nine every time I possibly could, watching everything that they did. And I tried to write it all down and put the book together, and it was published. But funny, in the middle of it, one day, Kevin left Simon & Schuster, and Margaret Clark took over as the Pocket editor of the Star Trek material. And she called
nonfiction.
Of the nonfiction.
Yeah.
Sure. And she called me and she said, put aside the Deep Space Nine companion. I want you to write a how-to-produce Star Trek book. And so I spent the next few months writing, along with Paula. Paula jumped right in with me. Star Trek Action, which is a big hardcover coffee table book. And I was about a little ways into Star Trek Action, and Marco Palmieri, who was another editor over there, called and said, "Hey, we need a companion book written to the movie Insurrection, and can you do that right away?" So I took 5 weeks off of Action, wrote the Secrets of Insurrection, and then finished the Action book, and then went back to the Deep Space Nine companion. So I wrote 3 books with Paula. I can't leave her out of this.
Sure.
Wrote 3 big books all at once, never having done it before. It was a trip.
Yeah,
but they got to depend on our stuff because writing nonfiction is a real different animal than writing fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'd had some nonfiction writers. You know, they had Alan Asherman a long time ago, and they had Larry Nemeczek for the Next Generation companion. But then they needed somebody extra, and so they got us, and they really liked our style on it.
Sure.
And our template on the Deep Space Nine companion was to use the TNG companion, but kind of on steroids.
Okay.
You know. So.
Well, you certainly have a lot of books now published between the two of you. I call out Star Trek 101 as being particularly good. And Star Trek Costumes has some beautiful photos of costumes from the original series and beyond.
Yeah, Star Trek Costumes, Paula has to take credit for most of the photography. She got on the phone and contacted places like the Smithsonian Institute and the Oxford Library and the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences and TV Guide and every place else, and negotiated with them to go through their archives and find old photographs of stuff that we couldn't find anywhere else.
Okay.
And then we wanted to take pictures of, you know, Paramount doesn't own any of that stuff, the costumes anymore. They were all auctioned off years ago. So Paula with John Van Sitters at CBS now,
and Marion Cordry,
they pulled together who owned some of the costumes. Actually, were able to borrow them, rent some mannequins, and hire a photographer and set up lights and took photographs. And it was a very big job. And
wow.
I credit Paula with just being right behind that. You know.
And I credit the guys at CBS Licensing for, you know, helping us out and setting up all that photography. You know, plus we spent 3 weeks down there looking through everything they already had in their archives.
Okay.
Yeah, you would think that, you know, Paramount for 50 years they've had all these pictures. You just pull out the one. Nope, they don't exist. It was very hard finding a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. I feel like maybe it's changed now, but back in the day, you hear all the time about how they would tape episodes and then they just reuse the tape, like they'd tape over old episodes, thinking, well, nobody's going to care about this, and people.
Well, I think that was a little earlier. That was like in the era of Johnny Carson and you know, Steve Allen, that type of thing. With Star Trek, they did have the originals and they had stuck them in a vault. But the stuff they were distributing were copies of copies. So, you know, the stuff you would see on those reruns were getting pretty threadbare.
Yeah.
And actually, the Trials and Tribble-ations episode helped inspire them to pull the originals out of the vaults. And that was when they got the idea to do the remastered stuff.
Sure.
Because they used one of those old prints to do the Trials and Tribble-ations episode, and it was so good that they said, well, we got it. This would be a good thing for us to sell.
Even before you wrote the Magic of Tribbles, your oral history of making the episode, you were no stranger to Tribbles. The Tribble Handbook came out in 1998. How'd that come about?
Well, no, that spun out of it. No, the book,
and it came out before the one.
The book, The Magic of Tribbles. Once again, Margaret Clark called and said, set aside whatever you're doing. You know, the Deep Space Nine companion at this point.
Sure.
And she said, I'd like to see if you can turn out a book about just a little topical piece about this one episode because it's so, you know, special. So I raced over. I spent 3 weeks. I interviewed all of the writers, all of the visual effects guys and such, transcribed the tapes, which is what we've left out about every one of our books.
Yeah.
I do these interviews and then spend hours and hours and hours transcribing. And and we wrote the book, the Magic of Tribbles, real fast. And then Margaret took it to the sales department at Pocketbooks, and the sales department said, we don't think we can sell this. Let's see if we can make a toy.
Yeah, they didn't think they could sell enough copies to make it worthwhile.
Right. They talked to the various bookstores. In those days it would have been Scribner's and Borders and Barnes and Noble, and none of the salesmen wanted to buy more than a copy or two for each store, and it wouldn't have paid off. Okay. So the sales department at Pocketbook said, "What if we made a little toy Tribble and attached it to the book?" And Margaret loved it, and they started into that. And then later on they said, that it would be too expensive a package. Why don't we make a pamphlet to go with the Tribble and make the book, instead of the book being major and the toy being secondary, make the toy major and the book secondary. Oh. And without us even being involved, they did the little pamphlet about Tribbles, attached it to the toy.
As I recall, the little booklet about Tribbles, basically, it was all the sidebars that had been planned for the Magic of Tribbles.
Right,
book.
That's what Margaret did. She just pulled out the sidebars, sent them to me. I said, "Are these okay?" So the question is, which came first, the Magic of Tribbles or the Tribble itself? And it's literally the chicken and egg question. At this point, you can't say which one was the cause of the other.
Well, I can vouch for the Magic of Tribbles. It is very informative, and it's clear that you talk to just about everybody, it seems like, in putting it together.
Everybody. When I was interviewing people on the set, for those 6.5 years that I lived on the set of Deep Space Nine, if I would walk onto an empty soundstage and see some, non-dialogue employee of the backlot of Paramount Pictures standing on a ladder changing the color of a wall, I would interview him. I interviewed I'm sure I interviewed 1,000 people for that book.
Sure.
And I just love doing it. It's really fun.
Speaking of interviews, you were both interviewed for the DS9 documentary, What We Left Behind. Is that right?
Terry was, because I couldn't make it down to California at the time. We had two elderly dogs who needed care, and I said, "You go, because you were actually on the set every day, and everybody's more familiar with you." So,
and I had not seen some of those people for many years.
Well, I'd imagine.
And when I walked into the little room that they had at Paramount Pictures, they were on the Paramount lot shooting these interviews. Ira Bear, the executive producer of Deep Space Nine, and Adam Nimoy, who was one of the producers on it, they greeted me like we were dearest old friends and had seen each other yesterday. It was really sweet. And they interviewed me for over an hour, asked a bunch of questions. I brought up some things that they said, "Oh, we're glad we said that because we'd forgotten about that." So it made me feel good. And I'm really looking forward to seeing this documentary when it comes out. I maybe didn't hit the cutting room floor.
We'll have to find out.
Well, and they also, it made us feel really good. They said that having the Deep Space Nine companion helped make that documentary possible, because
I'd imagine.
You don't remember everything that happened 20 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, everybody there said, we all have a copy, but they're all so torn up and wrinkled and dirty and coffee stains and everything. And we have a couple of them still in mint condition. I had taken one with me down there so we could take a couple photographs of it, and then I left it there, and they were thrilled just to have the book.
A clean copy of it.
Sure,
a clean copy of the book.
Yes, we're currently on a campaign for Pocketbooks to reissue the book.
Okay.
Because, they've got all the background stuff, and they keep thinking about it, but they're not sure if it would be worthwhile or not. So send those cards and letters in, guys.
Yeah, listen up. I would definitely pick one of those up. What do you think it is, going back to Tribbles, about Tribbles that you think people love so much? Why have they left such an impression on fandom?
Well, it's everyone's, whenever they've done those surveys, they've said, what's the best episode of the original series? And it's always broken into two categories. People say, well, my favorite episode is the Trouble with Tribbles, but the best episode is Sitting on the Edge of Forever. That's usually the response.
Right.
So they always separate it that way, and so everybody just loves the episode because I think I was listening to your interview about the original episode the other day, and it's just such a fun one because it allowed the various characters to kind of break out of their set characterization of themselves.
Sure.
So it was a funny episode, plus the acting in it was a little bit broad. Not so broad that they broke the character, but it was fun,
Yeah.
I mean, there's lines in there that actually I noticed when we were rewatching Trials and Tribble-ations, Shatner does this delivery on one thing where he says, storage compartment, and Sisko actually says it in exactly the same way in Trials and Tribble-ations. So a lot of the delivery and a lot of the stuff that went on, it's just stuck in people's minds.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the details of the episode. We are talking about Trials and Tribble-ations. It was first aired on November 4th of 1996. A lot of people worked on this episode, but specifically the teleplay is credited to Ronald D. Moore and Renee Echeverria. The story is by Ira Steven Behr, Hans Beimler, and Robert Hewitt Wolf. It was directed by Jonathan West, who was a director of photography on DS9 and also on TNG, and he directed several episodes of DS9. The star date given for the past version of this episode is 4523.7, and your assignment, Paula and Terry, if you can, is to give us a 25-word synopsis of Trials and Tribble-ations.
Shall I try this?
If you like.
The Defiant, the Deep Space Nine crew that we all know and love, is returning from Cardassia carrying a orb of time, the orbs being a Bajoran religious device, and they don't know it, but on the ship with them is a guy who happens to be Arn Darvin in disguise, a former Klingon from the original episode. And he manipulates the orb of time to throw them back 100 years because he has an intention to kill Kirk before any of this stuff happened. And our Deep Space Nine heroes come upon the plot and foil it aim to stop him.
Now,
Sure.
Obviously, all those adjectives, I'm sure, brought us over 25 words.
If you subtract adjectives and parentheticals, I think you're really close.
Yes, parenthetical comments.
25 words is very few. 25 is not a lot.
That's true. That's one floor on an elevator pitch. There are a lot of interesting facts about the memory banks for this episode, and you guys literally wrote the book on it, so I'd certainly love to hear your input on what you know about the episode. It was conceived as a tribute, of course, to to Star Trek for its 30th anniversary, and I believe that Paramount asked DS9 executive producer Ira Steven Behr to write a story that would commemorate that anniversary. And from what I've read, he originally wanted to focus on Charlie X, the first episode that you saw, Paula. It had been a favorite of his. And I think he knew, or he'd seen the actor who played Charlie, Robert Walker, around. So I think he knew that he could get a hold of him.
Robert Walker Jr., yeah.
Right.
I hadn't heard that.
Oh, okay.
But basically he said because Ira isn't as familiar with the original series. Now, that may well be true. But they did start looking right away at older episodes to do something with. Mm-hmm. By the way, Star Trek Voyager was also asked to do a tribute thing, and they found out before they started working, the Deep Space Nine crew found out before they started working on theirs that that episode was going to bring Sulu into it. So they thought, oh, gee, it would be copying if we used a character that had actually been in the show, one of the major characters.
Right.
So they started just thinking about doing a play, a takeoff on one of them, somehow getting some details into it. And the first thing, and basically Ira turned to Renee and Robert, who he considers the biggest Star Trek nerds on the staff, to come up with a theme for it. And so originally they thought about doing something based on
A piece of the action.
A piece of the action.
Right.
And Ron Moore's thought on that would be, what if they went back to that planet all these years later and found out that the people on the planet, because they had met Kirk and company, they were no longer emulating gangsters. They were suddenly all dressed up in Star Trek uniforms.
Right.
Because that was who they were imitating now.
Right,
They thought it was cool. And their technology had evolved, so they were basically living in a little fake Star Trek universe.
Yeah, Ron Moore said that they would have portrayed it as the planet of fandom.
Right. And I think the impression that they got that kind of crept in after a while was they were worried that fans would think that they were making fun of them or trying to.
That's exactly right.
Almost immediately, Renee Echevarria said, "Oh, the fans might start thinking we're poking fun at them," and Ira told me that from that moment on, nobody could get that thought out of their head, so they couldn't do it. But everybody was surprised a few years later when all of a sudden comes this motion picture Galaxy Quest, and there it is, exactly their idea. And in fact, their concern and worry was incorrect.
Yeah.
I think it all would have been in how you did it.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
You know, and Galaxy Quest worked wonderfully. You know, and it was kind of a tribute to the show, too. It might not have been that easy to do that for a regular episode of Deep Space Nine. Maybe. It might have come off a little bit hokey.
Yeah, and maybe it took the sort of outside view of people that weren't involved in Trek to sort of, even-handedly sort of praise it but make fun of it as well.
Probably.
Yeah, I think so.
Probably.
Yeah.
Well, they started talking about, well, what could we do instead? And they said, and then suddenly somebody had seen the movie Forrest Gump, which was
they all had, because it was a Paramount movie.
Yeah, it was a recent film, and they saw Tom Hanks shake hands with John F. Kennedy,
right?
And that visual effects shot was like groundbreaking. And so everybody came to the set and they said, "I wonder if we could do that. Would it be expensive? How could we do that? That would be better than just writing a news story with our guys on the Enterprise or something." And so they checked it out, and they went to one of the visual effects guys, Gary Hutzel, and Gary put together a shot from the Trouble with Tribbles and inserted one of his visual effects guys wearing a red shirt on the bridge of and showed it to everybody. Showed it to the writing staff, they showed it to Rick Berman, and nobody recognized that this extra character didn't belong there.
Right.
And that proved to them that they could do the visual effects that were necessary, but it was going to be really expensive.
Yeah.
So they spent the next few months, and literally figuring out how they could do it at a cost. And we ended up with Trials and Tribble-ations.
Yeah, I've seen that footage, I think, on YouTube. If you look it up, you can find it. And, it's great. I mean,
it's just this kind of tall, geeky guy standing on one side of the elevator. And if you look down, you'll notice he's wearing tennis shoes.
Right, yeah.
He's wearing a uniform, but those aren't the right regulation boots.
There's a crazy story about how they got Charlie Brill, who played Arn Darvin in the original episode.
Oh, yeah, a mission from God.
It's almost unbelievable that, they started talking about, they went out to lunch at a place called, what is it, Mulberry Street or something?
Yeah, Mulberry Street Pizza in Santa Monica.
Yeah.
And they went out there and they were just talking, well, who's still alive? Who can we use? But some of them were busy, some of them were dead.
Whit Bizzle was already dead. They had already killed off Koloth, a couple of other things like that where there were reasons that they couldn't. Whit Bizzle had been in another episode, I think. There were reasons that they just didn't dare use anybody else.
Right.
And suddenly they said, well, what about that guy Arn Darvin? He was kind of young, and Ira, who loves stand-up comedy and all that stuff, knew that Charlie Brill was a stand-up comedian, and he says, yeah, I think he's still working. In fact, he's got a role on a TV show right now. And son of a gun, and they thought, well, how could we contact him? And he was in the restaurant.
Yeah, I was talking to the guy, and he said, well, he's doing this television show called Silk Stockings, so we know that he's working, and in fact, he's sitting right over there. And
it was almost like he set it up.
Yeah, and Ira said the guys didn't believe him, and he said, no, turn around, look. he's really right over there. And they turned around, and there was Charlie Brill sitting at the counter.
Right.
And I interviewed Charlie Brill, and he said, I sure am glad I didn't go out to pizza. He said, I'm surely glad that I didn't go out for Chinese that day. I wouldn't have gotten the gig.
Yeah, Charlie and his wife, Mitzi McCall, were actors and comedians. Yeah, there's also a story about how they were booked on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th of 1964.
Right. Yes. Right. They were the act that was on right before the Beatles.
Yeah, exactly.
Or right after. I don't remember.
Right, yeah.
Which...
Yeah, there's a great This American Life story called Take My Break, Please, where they interview Charlie and Mitzi. And they even talk about a run-in that they had with John Lennon. Short version of the story, they had kind of a crappy dressing room, and the Coke machine was in their dressing room. And so while they're trying to get ready for the show, this guy, with a mop top comes in, and he gets a Coke, and then he starts talking to them, and they're kind of like, leave us alone. We're trying to get ready for the show here. And it turns out that was John Lennon. Which, by the way, and call me crazy, but in the episode, the original Trouble with Tribbles episode, if you look at Charlie Brill, when he's dressed up like Arn Darvin, he's in that gray kind of Nero suit. Right. He looks a little like John Lennon, just a little bit. If you squint to me, yeah. I'll have to Photoshop a mop top haircut.
And they styled his hair a little bit like that, although much shorter.
Yeah, the Nero suit wasn't that much different from some of those early Beatle suits that they wore.
Yeah.
It's all period piece stuff, If you talk about the 60s, it's recognizable from any photograph.
Yeah.
Well, and Charlie Brill had another story. He said the way he got hired to play in the original show in the Trouble with Tribbles in 67, 66. Mm-hmm. He said he was a friend of Lenny Nimoy. And Lenny called him one day and said, hey, I want to introduce you to somebody. He took him over to Paramount and he introduced him to Gene Roddenberry. And Brill didn't know who Roddenberry was, but Roddenberry looked at Brill and said, Arn Darvin. And Charlie Brill didn't know what that meant. He thought maybe it was a Jewish holiday. So it was, and a happy Arn Darvin to you. he said to Roddenberry. And then and they hired him, and he got the job, and that was the Trouble with Tribbles. So he said when he got hired to play the character again on Trials and Tribble-ations, he called up Leonard Nimoy to tell him, and Leonard said, wow, you must have really made a temptation. They use you once every 29 years.
Yeah, right. An impression.
Yeah. An impression. Yeah, you must have really made an impression. They use you once every 29 years.
Let's get that guy back, yeah. In The Magic of Tribbles, you guys go into great detail about the technical challenges the production faced, integrating some of that new footage and new actors into the scenes from the old show, and the painstaking work that the VFX people had to do. They had to hand paint shadows in some scenes and rotoscope. I'd have to imagine if this was done today, there'd be a lot more advanced computer tools probably to make it possible.
Oh, it'd be nothing to it.
Yeah, it'd be easy these days, and in fact, you see that all the time these days. Everything is possible.
Yeah.
In those days, they did the lineup with the guys getting chewed out by Kirk. And
right.
Just when they thought they got it right, they discovered there were some extra arms sticking out that didn't belong to anybody because they'd taken that character out.
Yeah, they didn't only put in Bashir and O'Brien. They had to put in another. They hired an actor, a very large guy, to put him in so he could cover up some of the people behind, because there was no way to fit it all into that lineup. And in the end, they couldn't correct this. So if you can freeze frame it and carefully count, there's one too many feet still in the picture.
Okay. Yeah. There's some great examples of how those sort of trials and problems led to new material, though, as well. Because of course we've got the Deck 15 girl, who's sort of inserted as a character in the new version of the episode.
Right.
Yeah, there are two waitresses that show up, and also the girl in the elevator, too.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the two waitresses was actually Jonathan West's girlfriend.
Oh, okay.
Who was also an actress, but she was pretty good.
Okay.
I think she's the one who was a little more of a smart aleck, although they both were.
Right.
So.
They said they had interviewed a number of, because the Deck 15 girl was just going to be a walk on and walk off. they had interviewed a bunch of people, but they didn't like any of them. So Renee Treveria had actually called a friend of his, a female actress, I forget her name now.
Deborah Emerson?
Yeah, something like that. And they said afterwards they were glad because later on they gave her more lines. The episode turned out to be something like 90 seconds too short.
Oh, okay.
And they said, what are we going to do? And so they came up with the paradox a scene where
Bashir wonders if she's actually his great grandmother.
Yeah, he wonders. She hits up on him, and he wonders if he could in fact be his own grandfather. And that scene was written just to fill out the space. And if they hadn't had an actress who could deliver lines, they wouldn't have been able to do it.
Oh,
Sure.
and by the way, I looked her up, and it's Deidre Emerson.
Deidre.
Yeah.
That's right. She was, I think, in a TNG episode as well, Captain's Holiday, earlier on.
I hope so, because I love when actors get work. I just think everyone who is acting should actually make a living doing it. I just hope so.
And something that occurred to me this morning when I was thinking about Trials and Tribble-ations and what they did to Arne Darvin, I thought, well, now you have a whole new perspective on that, because I don't know if that's a spoiler or not. No, everybody's seen it by now. There's a character in Star Trek Discovery who is a Klingon who was turned into a human, and now we know how much effort goes into it. Now, this was a decade before the Trouble with Tribbles took place. Maybe they got a little better at it, but it doesn't sound like it was too pleasant at the time, so they must have gotten much better at it by the time they changed Arne Darvin.
Sure, and I wonder if it was just because of if he started off as a smooth-headed Klingon or a bumpy-headed Klingon, because maybe the
they haven't addressed that.
Little easier, yeah. Speaking of actors, or maybe the lack thereof, it's a trend now in films to have digital recreations of actors, and they probably could insert like a Cyrano Jones or a Niels Barris into the episode if they were going to do it today.
If they could get permission from the estate,
that's true,
from the family. They probably could. It probably would be much easier. I don't look forward to the day when we're never looking at live actors. We're only looking at animated characters. It's not a pleasant futuristic thought.
And in fact, I love that they recast Harry Mudd, in Star Trek Discovery, a young one. And he's snarky enough. You can you look at him and you think, I could see him turning into Roger C. Carmel.
Sure, a few pounds later, but sure.
Yeah. Well, 10 years, actually, he got married to Stella after that episode.
That's right.
So, marriage does put pounds on you.
Well, we could take a little break and talk about Star Trek Discovery if you guys want to. It seems like you are watching Discovery and you're enjoying it. Yeah.
I especially am enjoying it. It is not traditional Star Trek, but I think when the studio hired J.J. Abrams to do those movies, I think that was a sign that they were going to take a little bend away from traditional Star Trek. And I actually like Discovery much better than Abrams' take on the universe.
Okay.
Because I think they're playing much fairer by what's canon.
Terry, do you have a similar outlook?
Yes, I'm not as locked into Discovery as Paula is. It is Star Trek, so I'm very locked in. But Paula really likes it, and I'm still sort of waiting for things to happen. Sure. But I love the fact that they were hinting at stuff in the past that now they're bringing, I don't want to do spoilers here, but now they're bringing them about. So if you had... people said, Lorca is not the kind of guy that Starfleet ever would have had. Well, now there's a reason that he may have disturbed the fan thought a little bit. And so I'm really interested in how the writers, and they're really good, how the writers are going to reconcile all of the things. How are they going to get from the technology that we're seeing in Discovery to the technology that we saw in the original series? Mm-hmm. How are they going to get from the way the universe look, the way Klingons look in Discovery to the way Klingons look in the original series to the way Klingons look on Deep Space Nine? I think that they're working it all out, and I'm fascinated by the corners that they've written themselves into and how they're writing themselves out of it.
Yeah. And I think Terry's only reservation with it is that the show is at times very dark and violent.
Sure.
And, I'm not a fan of that either, but I think that they're doing stories that justify it.
Yeah.
So I'm just really enjoying the ride.
In the book, you guys talk about how they had to, when recreating some of these scenes or trying to match them, they had to find like the perfect film stock and film speed to make sure that they could even do the effects that they wanted to do.
That's the reason they hired Jonathan West. They signed him on as the director, because they knew that the actors could handle their own work. And if they did any storyboarding or anything, the actors would know where they were supposed to stand and what their personalities were.
Sure. The
big challenge with Trial and Tribble-ations was locking together the old footage with some kind of new footage. So, and the kind of film stock they used back in the old days was really slow. And it doesn't even exist anymore today it doesn't exist at all. But it didn't exist, so they had to come up with a film stock, so they had to do lighting changes, and they had to paint in shadows. I mean, it was much more, a tremendous amount of effort, and if everybody involved hadn't cared, they wouldn't have gotten it done.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that you can see this was a real work of love for everybody. And it was fun for them, too, I mean, especially for Ron and Renee. And they had to really, before they could think about which episodes they were going to insert, or which scenes they were going to insert the DS9 characters into, they really had to go over footage with Jonathan West. And he would look at it and they'd say, okay, we can fit Dax and Sisko into the background of this shot, no problem. And there were other scenes they couldn't use because it just wouldn't have worked. I mean, with Dax on the bridge in that scene where Kirk sits on the Tribble, they had to make her be bending over because she's so tall to start out with, and they had a very little window of space to fit her in so that it would have looked proportionally correct.
Right.
So it was a lot of work, and, both before and after.
they had some coincidences, too. I mean, if you look at the original series, Kirk doesn't always wear the same shirt. He only wears the same shirt a few times.
Right.
And they wanted to do the scene where Sisko actually meets Kirk, put the two captains together. So it was almost necessary for the episode.
Sure.
And they came up with an idea of a shot, I think it was from Mirror,
yes, it was.
That Sisko, a young lady walks up and talks
Marlena Monroe.
Comes up and talks to Kirk, and they thought if we can put Sisko into that position, it'd be great. And coincidentally, Kirk's wearing the shirt that he's wearing in the Trouble with Tribbles.
Right.
It just worked out.
It was kismet.
It was a mission from God, they called it. But there were spots where in the original series Kirk is standing or walking, I think, and a non-dialogue actor walks in front of him and he can't see Kirk's hand. So they found in another episode where Spock, Leonard Nimoy, is standing with his hand in that position. So they took his hand out of one episode and put it. They took Spock's hand from one episode and put it on Kirk's arm for this episode. It was a ton of work.
Yeah.
And very detailed.
Yeah, no kidding. Speaking of labors of love, there's a guy you mentioned in your book a couple times named Greg Jein, who's a model.
Oh, yeah, Greg.
And he's the best.
He was instrumental in creating some of the models and the pieces for the recreated episode.
And he was working on them before they even told him to work.
Well, somebody mentioned to him, "Hey, we might do a tribute to Tribbles," and he just jumped in and built a 6-foot Enterprise. And then while he was doing it, because he said they never had it before, he built the K2 space station.
No, they did have a K2 space station, but never a big one. He did one that would proportionally work with the ship.
Okay.
What they had never had in the original episode was a Klingon cruiser.
Oh, okay.
Or Bird of Prey, sorry. Or wait, no, it was cruiser. Klingon cruiser. And he built that, too, even though they didn't necessarily need it, but they thought, what the hell, will you?
Stick it in there, sure.
Yeah.
And you'll notice that Paul is the kind of person that adamantly wants to be accurate about whether it was a Klingon bird of prey or a Klingon cruiser.
Well, that was my job.
Right.
My job was when I read these manuscripts that came into me, if they were wrong about one of the details, I'd send a note to Pocketbooks and say, no, it wasn't a bird of prey, it was a cruiser.
And I have to live with this woman. Think of how careful I have to be.
No kidding. But you've written so many reference books and you retain all these facts. You could probably really clean up in a Star Trek pub quiz.
Oh, probably.
Well, maybe, except the problem now is that because we are so old, our memories are failing. We remember all the details, but the names start to slip away.
Okay, yeah.
Really?
There's a local... There's a local group here that does a Star Trek pub quiz every month or so, and I always go thinking, I'm a big fan. I got a Star Trek podcast. I can do this. And I always leave going like, of course, why didn't Michael and Sarah, how did I forget that?
Exactly, you can see the person's face right in your mind, but you can't think of the name.
Right.
Really? Well, even way back then, it was 20 years ago, but I would be on the set, and every once in a while I would call one of the day players or one of the one episode only actors. I would call them by the character name instead of their actor name, their real name.
Yeah.
And then I always had to apologize instantly. I recognized my
if you could pick any classic episode or even a more recent one from a Trek series to give the Tribble-ations treatment to, which one would it be?
Ooh, hadn't ever thought about that. That's a brand new... You're very good. A question no one's ever asked.
I know.
My goodness.
I'm thinking about the fact that you mentioned Spock's brain. Now, I don't think that would make an especially good update, but I do love that episode. And
Me too.
I just wanted to say that I was responsible for that being chosen to be the one done by the Improv years ago.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah.
Did you ever see that or hear about it?
I've heard about it, yeah.
Yeah, they the people from the Improv came to us and said, we want to do one of the Star Trek episodes. We won't change it at all. We'll do the exact dialogue. But, being that they're the Improv, they'll be kind of funny at it.
Sure.
And so, so everybody's starting to think about episodes, and my boss was saying, well, why don't you use one of the funny ones, like the Trouble with Tribbles, or, a piece of the action or something. I said, no, I think they want to do something serious, because then they could have more fun with it. If it's a comedy to start out with, how much funnier can you make it?
Right.
So I was the one who suggested Spock's brain, because I thought that's perfect, because it's a comedy disguised as a drama.
Right, yeah. I think if you're going to remake something, I think a good rule is remake something that didn't get it right the first time. So I guess I'd throw out Turnabout Intruder. Find some way to behind the scenes redeem it, like body swap a couple more times, show just because the action is so ridiculous and kind of insulting, but show that in some other context it actually kind of makes sense.
Yeah, there's lots of them. I'd actually have to think a while to come up with a different example, because there's a lot of possibilities.
I wonder, do you think the real fans who have been around for their entire lives have been deep into this? I commend all of them. I love them to death. But if you did, bonk bonk on the head differently, would they resent it, or would they like it? I'm not sure how some of these things would be received. Can you take? There's an episode of The Next Generation where the people are wearing almost like diapers and stuff, and
right,
if you redid that, you could really, really improve things. But would it be sacrilege to do it? I'm not
Probably.
sure.
Well, it would almost be funny making the Star Trek characters, whichever series you were doing, dress up in that stuff.
Right. Plus, you need the Mayberry set to do Miri again, and that's long gone.
Yes,
you
you would.
You would.
Yes, that's true.
You would.
This is a very funny episode by design, as was the original Trouble with Tribbles, but that didn't necessarily sit well with the production staff back in the 60s. Roddenberry, Samuel Peoples, and even Bob Justman all came out at one time or another to say that they didn't like the original Tribbles episode because Trek shouldn't be funny. What do you think about that?
Well, they thought it was disrespecting the characters.
Uh-huh.
and it looks like everybody just had a lot of fun with it.
Well, sure.
So, and I think they didn't anticipate just how popular that episode would be.
Oh, yeah.
But the people who created the original Trek, like Jein and all the others, they had a more serious take on it because they had just created this thing.
Sure. Yeah.
And later on you think, oh yeah, it would be fun to do that. Change of pace.
Yeah, well, and I think we need to give a little credit to the Tribble itself. That little fuzzy ball with no mouth, no eyes, no legs, you can't figure out how it could possibly do anything except lay there, is so cute. And then, having it purr like a mourning dove and all of that made it so cute. I think it instantly became extremely enduring, and that probably saved the episode. If they'd used something like worst childhood pet or something, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
So we have to thank David Gerald, too, for writing that episode.
Absolutely.
Yeah, who is a funny guy, so he's going to produce a funny script for sure.
Yeah.
Speaking about the effect of the Tribbles themselves and just seeing them on screen, I'd agree. If you go and watch the animated series episode, More Tribbles, More Troubles,
yes,
which is also fun and written by Gerald. It's
right.
not quite the same. They're just kind of like cotton candy puffs, and you don't get the.
And they're all pink.
And they're
Why
all pink.
Are they pink?
Yeah. Well,
Why were they pink?
I actually read that because Hal Sutherland, the director and producer of the series, was colorblind. He didn't know they were pink. He just saw light gray.
Oh, so somebody in the...
Nobody told him?
Somebody in the art department came up
department?
with the pink, yeah, and then he, I guess, never just nixed it because he never really thought about it.
Oh, you know what? They must have thought it was a children's show, Saturday morning.
Yeah,
maybe.
Right,
Pink.
exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But it was funny. And lately I've been seeing on the internet, spend too much time on social media, but there's pictures going around of Tribbles with teeth that are very scary these days. I don't know if they're supposed to be mirror universe Tribbles. I hope it's not a look into the future of Star Trek Discovery.
and that's a kind of a funny thought, mirror universe Tribbles. That is kind of strange.
Oh, maybe
well, and we have
evil,
seen
sure.
Lorca with a Tribble on his desk, and I'm kind of wondering why.
Yeah, exactly.
And my friends at CBS tell me that the writers have promised they will explain why the Tribble is there, and I'm waiting.
Interesting.
I'm waiting.
Yeah.
But if a mirror universe Tribble would be the exact opposite, does that mean they don't eat?
Right.
Either that or they eat people.
Right. They're very abstemious, and they don't breed.
I think,
yeah.
I think if you had that many Tribbles on your ship and they were mirror universe ones, I don't think the crew would be left behind.
Yeah, it would just be Tribbles.
The special effects guy on Deep Space Nine was asked to make Tribbles that would move and things for the episode, because they had to have Tribbles that they could
walk
Dax,
a little bit.
Well, and Dax and Sisko were crawling through, and they had them wiggling a little bit. So we had little servo motors, and guys off to the side with joysticks making them move. But they had to blow one up. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen this 20 years ago. They beam it out into space and blow it up, and so they had to literally do the explosion and photograph it. And Gary said he felt really terrible when he wired a couple of Tribbles. They made several of them because they had to do several shots. And as he was wiring them with little blasters inside, he felt terrible. And when they blew it up, it broke his heart. He murdered Tribble.
Yeah.
He really didn't like doing it.
Yeah, I think we said in that book, The Magic of Tribble, something like, no real Tribbles were killed for the making of this episode.
I should reread that book.
Yeah. I love Dax's involvement in the episode, and I think I read that the writers liked using her as kind of, their stand-in. Because,
yeah, she was their surrogate.
Yeah.
And ours, and the public's.
Sure.
Yeah, because she had ostensibly been around at the time, and she's the one who said that she had a relationship with Leonard McCoy, and he had the hands of a surgeon even then, when they were in college.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing for people who are trying to write scripts and such. It is good to have one character who has sort of the audience point of view, because it gives the viewer something to identify with. The viewer isn't so outside of it if there's somebody inside who represents them. And Dax and Terry Farrell did a tremendous job at it. I think she was really good.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. She's sort of like reliving her glory days, like it's like the 60s, the 2260s, of course.
I know. And she says, look at the classic lines of this tricorder.
Right, yeah.
It's beautiful.
Well, as we start to wrap up here, can you think of any last thoughts that you have about the episode or your connection to it?
If you pay attention to fights the way they're done today on screen, I mean, they're real quick, punches and people. We all understand about fighting, but when the 1966 show was done, they shot it like a Western, these big roundhouse swinging blows, and it was old-fashioned fighting, and it was what was expected then. So when they did the new show, they had to match the old style of fighting. So the fight goes on for longer than you would have not done on a normal DS9, and it's really fun to kind of watch, the slow spinning instead of quick punches.
Yeah. And a fight that looks like it could have come out of a 1960s Western.
Sure,
yeah, I mean, you can see John Wayne throwing those punches rather than the way that, O'Brien would have actually thrown punches.
Yeah. Put a set of saloon doors on the little bar there, and you're all set.
Exactly.
Exactly. Well, that's what the sliding door was like.
Yeah.
Just
I still love the story that I heard about John Dwyer, the guy who did set stuff for the original show, had gotten all these chairs, these futuristic-looking chairs for that scene, but they had to rent them from showrooms because it was all the chairs that they could find. And so they told the director, under no circumstances can any of these chairs be damaged during this fight scene. So as soon as Scotty lays the punch on Korath, everybody shoots up and does that move where the chairs slide out, and they're gone for the rest of that scene. There are no chairs in that scene anymore. That's good directing.
Don't hurt our chairs.
Really. Making this stuff is harder than you expect. If you just watch it once, you think, oh, that must have been easy. But by golly, it ain't easy.
The fact that they were able to is one of those things that makes you believe in it was meant to be.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Robert Blackman happened to find some of the cloth that the Klingon uniforms were made out of, and,
Right.
He actually found a couple of the actual uniforms, and he found a couple of the sashes, too, which were really hard to duplicate if you didn't have an example in front of you.
And didn't I read that the Klingon belts were made of like bubble wrap or something like
that? Yes, which
wrap
was very exotic at the time.
Yeah, it was a brand new thing, so they just took bubble wrap and spray painted it, and nobody had ever seen such a thing before.
And a last shout out to the hairdressers who worked on Trials and Tribble-ations. The hair was great.
Oh yeah,
great. Especially Bashir's terrible haircut.
Yes, very classic.
I know, it looks like guys I went to high school with. It was kind of like people who'd seen the Beatles and wanted to sort of look like them, but didn't.
Right, yeah. Well, now that we're at the end of the show, I have a very important question. Let's see. We'll talk My Space Dad Can Beat Up Your Space Dad. Who is your favorite captain and why?
Ooh.
Oh, well, for me, that's not difficult. I think Sisko is the best well-rounded character in Star Trek.
Interesting.
He is a fabulous father to Jake. He's so smart. When Q comes on Deep Space Nine and he is insulting Sisko just punches him.
Yeah.
And Q says, Picard never punched me, and Sisko says, I'm not Picard. I love that man.
And as for my choice, it's hard. It depends on the context. People used to say, well, who would you rather be? If you were on a part of the crew, who would you rather be your captain? And I think it was a lot more fun in the original series, because they were going out space adventuring, and there was probably a little bit too much politics on the Next Generation ship. Everybody was very well behaved and all that. And when I was writing fanzine stories, I must admit, I put myself as a lieutenant on the Starship Enterprise,
Sure.
the original one.
Kind of like Sisko, you're not pushing your luck. Lieutenant's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as long as you weren't a red shirt,
Right.
you probably would come through alive on Kirk's ship.
Other than Sisko, can you see any other Trek captain taking Kirk's place in this episode? Or, excuse me, taking Sisko's place?
Taking Sisko.
Oh, in the
episode.
If they'd redone this Trials and Tribulations for Enterprise,
for
or
Enterprise,
Voyager,
or for Voyager, yeah. Can you see any of the other captains?
I think they all could have done it. I think that Janeway would have had the most fun with it. But, obviously a sex alteration there.
Sure.
That's true, but your question is one of writing. If the screenplay were good, if the writers knew, really had good intentions and were good at what they do, any of them could do the part.
But I think if you look at those holodeck adventures on Voyager, and how much fun she had playing Arachnia.
Sure, yeah.
I think she could have had the most fun with it.
Yeah.
She really threw herself into it.
Yeah, she works hard, but she plays hard. I like that about her.
Yeah. She's very interesting, and Scott Bakula, wonderful character, but as his character on Enterprise, he was very serious.
Yeah, that's true.
And I kept on wanting him to break free like he did in Quantum Leap,
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we've often discussed this. We have, over the years, had reason to come up with photography from all of the shows, and I don't think we've ever seen a photograph of Archer smiling. Scott played him.
True. He did. I mean, all of his publicity stills for every year were very serious.
Right.
Yeah, Scott played him very serious. He didn't seem to have a whole lot of lightness going by. Now, maybe it was for they were in a very serious situation. They were first time ever blindly going where no man has gone.
Right.
And he had to, be intense, but I just wanted to see Archer smile once.
Archer, you need to smile more.
He probably smiled when he was a little kid, like making models with his dad and flying.
Or maybe
ships
when
and
he
stuff.
was playing with his dog.
Yeah, right. Or maybe, playing with Porthos.
In the privacy of his cabin.
But just to toss this out before we go away, I really like Enterprise. I think it's a great 4 seasons.
I've just been getting back into it recently, and I am discovering that there is a lot that I do like about it. I think it's very reflective of the time that it came out. It was... I'm sure they had this idea before, but it's after 9/11, and there are certain things that they're trying to communicate. It
debuted right after it.
Yeah.
It debuted right after 9/11.
Yeah.
But we saw the pilot. We were lucky enough to be invited to see the pilot before it aired on the big screen on the Paramount lot. So we saw it on a full-size giant screen.
Pretty cool.
It looked really cool. And my first comment when the lights came up, I said, recut it around the commercial breaks and put it into the theaters. It would have worked great for me in 1,050 theaters opening weekend.
Sure.
So.
At the end of every show, each guest receives a commission in our Starfleet and the rank of ensign. What department on the ship would you two work in?
The two of us? Well,
Yes.
I'd have to go with my fanzine character, and she worked in the linguistics department.
Okay, all right, there you go.
Really?
Yes. Really?
You actually come up with these wonderful brand new questions.
Oh, I see.
What department do you want to work in, Terry?
I don't know. I don't want to. I never want to leave the ship. I don't want to get in trouble, so I'll give me janitorial.
It must exist. We never see it, but it must exist somehow.
I know somebody keeps things clean.
That's right. Somebody mops those decks for sure.
And now I'm waiting to see the episode.
Yeah, we'll see that maybe in Discovery.
Well, there was an episode called Lower Decks.
Yeah.
And even though my janitorial character didn't make it, he would be with them.
Yeah, he'd hang out with those guys.
Yeah.
Sure. playing their own smaller poker game, smaller stakes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. His dream would be to be able to sit in someday.
Right. He's on the waiting list for the poker game.
Yes.
Sure.
I want to sit in and play with those guys.
Well, Ensigns Block and Erdmann, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can, at EISTPod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
Facebook.
Yeah, me too, Facebook.
Or Twitter. We don't have our own website. We're just too lazy to have gotten one started.
Yeah, but if you look at our books, you'll notice we both use our middle initials.
Sure.
Yeah.
So if you do Terry J. Erdmann and Paula M. Block, Facebook and Twitter, we're on both of them. We welcome people to join, to talk to us, to friend us, or to unfriend us as they wish. But we're pretty open to everybody.
Yeah. Well, that's the nice thing about Twitter is that you really can feel like you're participating in things. Because I notice, like, all the actors from Discovery, if they really like something, they'll respond to people.
Sure.
And Mark Hamill responds to people. You know, it gives you a chance to feel like you're part of the group.
You're crossing the streams, Paula. You're crossing the streams.
No.
Yeah, wait a minute. It's a lot different than the old days of writing to William Shatner and getting the form letter reply back from Paramount.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Very
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. So.
And your books like Star Trek 101 and I the Constable are available on Amazon and other places where books are sold?
Yeah, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You might find copies in small bookstores
Yeah,
everywhere.
it's probably easiest to find our stuff on Amazon because sometimes it's considered specialty stuff, like our book that we wrote about Labyrinth last year for that movie's 30th anniversary. Mm-hmm. It was a big hardcover color book. You know, it was kind of like the costume book, but a lot of stores thought, this, I don't know if people will buy this. It's expensive. So it's mostly been sold on Amazon, and Target carried it for really good prices.
Oh, great.
Places like that. So just look it up. And The Magic of Tribbles, by the way, is still available as an ebook. It was Pocketbook's first nonfiction ebook.
That was one of my proudest moments. One day somebody told me that I had to buy a copy of Publishers Weekly magazine, which I never expected to be mentioned in, and there was a little, like, one column or maybe 2 column inches thing that says Simon & Schuster test markets the electronic book, and it said their first fiction book will be by Stephen King, and their first nonfiction book will be by Terry J. Erdmann. One sentence with me and Stephen King in it. I treasure. I can't remember what his book was, but it was one of those moments in history, you know.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Well, thanks again for joining me.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We are signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.
It's on your mind.